Well, all right, my friends, let's get going. This is Nostalgia Trap, and my name is David Parsons. I am happy to share this conversation with you. We're talking about the JFK assassination today, a topic that I never get tired of, in part because, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, as we talk a lot about on the show here, and it was hard to avoid the JFK assassination as this sort of like shadow in pop culture, in political discourse, in the stuff that like my parents and older people talked about. So I love talking about sort of how this event, this insane, very shady murder that took place in broad daylight in Texas, and then, the murder of the alleged assassin just a few days later. All of that, it's clear, all of that launched a lot of people from that generation into another dimension and another understanding of how things work in this country. And it's sort of it's a nightmarish event from which I think in a lot of ways this country really never recovered. So even though I didn't live through the Kennedy assassination, and maybe you didn't either, maybe you did, I'm not sure what your generational position might be. But either way, there is a shadow there, and it sort of brought us into, I think, a sort of a darker vision of the way this country works that we're still very much in. So my guest today has a lot to say about that. His name is Carl Freedman. He is a professor at Louisiana State University. He's written a ton of books over the years about Marxist cultural theory, American crime films, science fiction. All of his stuff is really, really deep and really interesting. But I wanted to speak with him specifically about this book he wrote about Oliver Stone and the movies that Oliver Stone has made about presidents, specifically JFK and Nixon. This book is called American Presidents and Oliver Stone, Kennedy, Nixon, and Bush Between History and Cinema. So there was a lot to talk with Professor Freedman about here. And this was a really fun conversation, so I hope you enjoy it. We ended up talking mostly about JFK and this murder and all the conspiracy stuff and Oliver Stone's vision of what that stuff means in this conversation. But we also had a conversation about Nixon that will be up on the bonus stream next week for Patreon subscribers. So go check that out. The link for our Patreon is always in the episode description. Lots of stuff going on for subscribers lately, including Mr. Trap, our new podcast all about the 90s sketch comedy show, Mr. Show with Bob and David. It's a chance for me and my friends Peter and Jeff to talk about and work out our obsessive love for Bob and David and that show and what it did for us in the 90s. It fits right in there with all the other Nostalgia Trap stuff. So if you want to check that out, again, link is in the episode description, patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. All right, enjoy this conversation. Here is me talking with Carl Freedman. Well, all right, Carl Freedman, thank you so much for joining me. It's good to see you.
Good to be here.
Your work spans a lot of different time periods and a lot of different subjects. And so for me, finding your body of work and the writing that you've been putting out for years about media, about television, movies, politics, culture, it's a big body of work. So I think I wanted to start by saying congratulations for having put out so much over your life, because it's a kind of an inspiration to the rest of us, I think.
Well, thank you very much.
You write about science fiction. You write about crime fiction. But the thing that caught my attention, maybe somewhere we can start and actually think maybe it intersects with all this stuff, is you wrote a book about the movies JFK and Nixon, the president movies made by Oliver Stone. I think JFK came out in 1991, if I'm correct.
I believe that's right.
Yeah. And Nixon came out in later in the 90s. We've talked about those movies a bit over the years on this show. But what was your I guess maybe we can start with if you can remember, what was your initial sort of reaction to the idea of Oliver Stone making a movie about JFK? and the assassination in particular, because it seems like it was a subject of a lot of conversation in the culture, obviously, for many years since the assassination. But I remember, I mean, I was young, but I remember when this movie came out, and it was kind of a moment, a cultural moment. Do you remember anything about what that was like? Did you think it brought the assassination and awareness of the assassination conspiracies to the public in a bigger way than ever before? Is that what that movie did?
Oh, it did, definitely. I mean, it had a lot of effects. Some of them very specific. I mean, the Congress passed laws declassifying a lot of material relating to the assassination that had not been publicly available before the film. And but I think the main thing that happened with the response to the film, or at least the main immediate thing that happened with regards to response to the film, and I talk about this a good deal in the book, is the amazing campaign of vituperation against it. It was just incredible. It went from one side of the kind of mainstream political spectrum in America to the other, liberals, conservatives, everybody ganged up on Oliver Stone.
What were the criticisms of this film? I mean, I remember a little bit of it that there was sort of like Oliver Stone was being irresponsible with the facts of history, that this is a conspiracy theory movie. I mean, there were a lot of different angles, I think, on it seems like he touched a raw nerve with this movie.
Well, yeah. I mean, for whatever reasons, ever since the Warren Commission report came out a year or so after the assassination, it has been a profound transgression of accepted mainstream norms to disagree with it, even though virtually, not quite, but almost every scholar who has seriously gone into the Warren report has felt that it's completely inadequate, including a committee of the U.S. Congress, which concluded that there probably was a conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy. It concluded that there was almost certainly a conspiracy to assassinate Martin Luther King, and probably not a conspiracy to assassinate Bobby Kennedy. They investigated all of those. So although, as I say, virtually all serious investigators, not quite all, but almost all serious investigators have felt there was some kind of conspiracy. And although a substantial majority of the American public, according to polls, has also felt that there was a conspiracy, it's been considered by the kind of people who, dominate journalistic norms to be just unacceptable. And it was considered to be unacceptable in that way. And here's an interesting example, which I glancingly mention in the book. Film critics who tended to treat the film, simply as a work of cinematic art, and were less interested in its, relationship to actual history, tended to praise the film very highly. Roger Ebert wrote a review which was extremely laudatory. I mean, he said, this is going to be studied by film scholars and filmmakers for many years to come, which I think is true. I mean, the editing was, for one thing, was very innovative. It had I think I wouldn't swear to this. It has maybe still the largest cast of speaking parts of any film ever made, if not the very largest, certainly, up there. And Eber also said that he happened to be interested in the Kennedy assassination. He said that he'd read a lot of books about it, and that he said he was pretty obvious there must have been some, that there's a lot we don't know, that the Warren report was inadequate. So anyway, that was the review he wrote when it came out. And then some years later, he wrote another essay about it. He had a series called Great Movies.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
In which were longer than his ordinary reviews, and which also had the advantage, he just picked the movies he liked the best and wrote about them. In which he tells the anecdote that he somehow, he doesn't explain exactly how, he ran into Walter Cronkite somewhere or another shortly after his review came out, and Cronkite just attacked him. I mean, not physically, but verbally attacked him furiously for having praised the film. And indeed, although he doesn't exactly recant anything he said in his first review, it's a much less enthusiastic.
That's interesting.
In tone, as if he was really, Walter Cronkite. This was the time that Cronkite was typically described as the most trusted man in America, certainly the most influential television journalist, probably the most influential journalist. So I guess to have him yelling at you, it would have been an intimidating thing, and he certainly seems to have been intimidated by it. But everybody, everybody in the sense of mainstream journalists, Tom Wicker among the liberals, George Will among the conservatives, everybody just thought it was disgraceful that Oliver Stone wasn't paying sufficient homage to the Warren Report. Wow. Even though, as I say, the Warren Report, it's very difficult to maintain that it's even remotely adequate. A couple of people have tried to do it, but
I think it's pretty widely accepted, which is kind of that the Warren Report is a bunch of bullshit, and that there's a story that's not told there, and the government's hiding it. I mean, it seems like it kind of, the story is often told, obviously, about like this post-60s, post-Watergate, post-JFK assassination, this kind of like loss of faith in our institutions and trust, and we can still see that active pretty much everywhere in American culture and politics. But I don't know, there's something about the form of JFK, the editing you mentioned, and it's weird because I'm trying to square like the Walter Cronkite vision of being having some fidelity to quote unquote capital T truth, and then what Oliver Stone creates, which is sort of like, to me, a vision of a kind of subjective obsession about the assassination. Like Jim Garrison, we're in Jim Garrison's sort of like paranoid mind, we're in Oliver Stone's paranoid mind, but at the same time it seems like that rabbit hole that is open in that movie, it's a great depiction of kind of how one goes crazy when they think about the assassination, because like you mentioned, every character in the world is involved in this thing, and it just opens up more, and the more you look at it, the more you open up more dark corners of it. And it just seems like the movie, in some ways, when I think about that initial reception to it from film critics who like the aesthetic, and then maybe liberals or conservatives or political people who don't like its history, to me, it's kind of like, now I see it as all one thing. Does that make sense? Like, it kind of like what Oliver Stone created was sort of a vision of what it's like to think about the assassination.
Yeah, and the film, the film is not particularly definite as to a theory of the assassination. This is the thing that was almost always gotten wrong. People say that Stone says that there was a conspiracy of thousands of people. Well, no, he doesn't say that. They're certainly not thousands. There are some ideas that are put forward as probable that there were elements of the upper reaches of the military and elements of the CIA that were probably involved, and perhaps others as well. But nobody's ever named as a conspirator except Clay Shaw, who Jim Garrison actually did in real history indict for murder, for conspiracy to murder the president. Although what's interesting, in a lot of the film is devoted to Garrison's closing summation to the jury, and in fact, he says very little about any evidence that Clay Shaw as an individual was responsible. He talks more about much larger political issues. And,
yeah, that Mr. X section. I feel like that's the section of the film with Donald Sutherland.
That's a good one. Yeah,
it's great that it's Donald Sutherland because I mean, I think I mentioned this in my email to you. I wrote a book about GI coffee houses in the 1960s and 70s, the sort of like radical anti-war coffee houses, and Sutherland was deeply involved in that, along with Jane Fonda and a few other celebrities. And he was known for his kind of conspiratorial takes on what was going on with the Vietnam War. I think a lot of people were subjected to that, obviously, in that era. But it's interesting to me. Part of the I don't know fun and of JFK and that film is seeing the sort of like the people who were active in the Vietnam War and the movement against it and the counterculture, people like Oliver Stone and Donald Sutherland appearing in this film and kind of giving their takes. But that Mr. X character isn't real, right? That's kind of an amalgamation character that's meant to just give us a lot of, I don't know, exposition about the government and their involvement.
Well, first of all, we should call him Colonel X.
Sorry,
that is
Mr. Yeah,
that is supposed to be his. I mean, he's supposed to be retired from the military at the time that he's portrayed talking to Jim Garrison, but that's supposed to have been his highest rank in the military. He's often said to be based on an actual colonel named Fletcher Prudy, who did write a book about what he believed was a conspiracy to assassinate Kennedy, and who worked with Oliver Stone. He was a consultant in the film.
He's the guy that kind of puts it all together for you. It's such a moment in the movie where it's like the one like secondary source, I guess, where you get to hear like a historian put all those pieces of evidence, fractured pieces of evidence we've seen the whole movie. You sit down on a bench with Donald Sutherland, and he kind of explains it all to you. It's to me like the most memorable part of the movie in a lot of ways, and I think one of the ones that like you're talking about these sort of like political or historical critics. I think that's a scene that they maybe had the most problems with because it's the most, I don't know, it's the most straightforwardly interpretive one, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, Colonel X, the main point he makes in that long scene on the bench is that what's really crucial, I think he is speaking for Oliver Stone here, is that what's really crucial is the politics of the thing. I mean, that exactly who, when, where, those are all just details, or I think scenery is the way he puts it, that it's the why that is really crucial, that the importance of the Cold War for American capitalism and the importance of what was to become, well, already was to some degree, and was to become in a much bigger way, the Vietnam War for American capitalism. That's really, that's what Stone is fundamentally interested in, and that's in a sense, one way you could read the film. I don't think I talk about this really in the book, but I mean, if you want to, you could read the whole conspiratorial thing as a kind of metaphor. In other words, I'm sort of thinking off the top of my head here.
Please, I love this.
I didn't write that, but assume for a moment that the Warren report is actually true. That there was this weird loner with this very strange background in the Marines and probably with the CIA. But in any case, there was this weird loner named Lee Oswald, not Lee Harvey Oswald, by the way. That's a small but interesting point we can take up in a moment. Okay. There was this weird loner named Lee Oswald, who, for reasons that nobody has ever really known, decided to kill the president. Let's say that's true. You can assume that that's actually true, but that doesn't change anything really as far as the big political picture is concerned. I mean, Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson went on to massively escalate the Vietnam War, and it was the ultimate expression of the Cold War, and it so much overplayed the Cold War hand that it resulted in the shattering of the Cold War consensus. So I mean, that's what's important. That's what's important in terms of I think JFK as historical fiction.
The how and the why are balanced out there in some ways. Like
if those people didn't conspire to kill the president, and if we assume, which is itself a controversial matter, but if we assume that Kennedy who for most of his career was a very ardent Cold Warrior, but if we assume, which is plausible, by no means inarguable, but it is arguable. It is not implausible. If we assume that Kennedy had decided to make a real change during the last 6 months, year of his life, if the kind of people that Stone suggests may have conspired to kill him didn't conspire to kill him, they were very negligent. They were really, they were derelict in their historical duty, as it were. Let me just say as a footnote, since I mentioned it.
I'd love the Lee Harvey thing.
It's a very small point, but I mean, his name was actually Lee Harvey Oswald, but he was never called that. He was, I mean, like most of us, most of us go by our first name and our last name, and he was always Lee Oswald to everyone he knew. Now, it's true that when he was arrested by the Dallas police, and they, did the initial arrest sheet, they as was routinely done, they would list his full name, which was Lee Harvey Oswald, and so that's how it first got out to the press. So that's one fairly innocuous reason why. But as I say, there are those of us who've always thought that there was something else going on. Why was in the journalistic discourse was it always Lee Harvey Oswald? Lee Harvey Oswald. I mean, everybody who's arrested has all the names on the arrest sheet, and it's always seemed to me. I mean, not that I'm the first person to have thought of this, but prior to this time, there was only one presidential assassin whose name was really widely known to the American public, John Wilkes Booth. And the notion that presidential assassins have three names, I think may have been
or serial killers, like a John Wayne Gacy, and like it feels like there's a certain level of criminal notoriety, and you get the three name Grace. I don't know. There's something to it for sure. I wonder if I saw this clip of David Crosby going around the other day because he passed away, and there was a figure of a kind of he had a kind of paranoid conspiracy mind. But one of the clips that was going around was him just a few years after the assassination in the late 60s. He's on stage and he's telling the crowd, "Hey, listen, Like the story of what happened in the JFK assassination, it's all bullshit. There were actually multiple shooters, and like they're keeping it from you, they're lying to you, you know. And he's kind of sounds like that kind of '60s hippie guy, but it feels like he's saying something a little transgressive at that moment. I wondered if that's your experience when you were around during this era. Was it? I mean, did it take time for people to start doubting the Warren Commission and speaking conspiracies, or was that kind of a fringe idea among counterculture people like David Crosby, or how did that develop? Because it seems like now no one believes anything, you know, like something happens and people are immediately saying it's fake. But I wonder if that's tied up with that, because it feels like important that the assassination and the kind of story falls apart. It seems like it's connected to other things in American life.
It didn't take very long. Uh, the first book length critiques of the Warren Report came out within, I don't have the dates, the exact dates in my head at the moment, but it was within a year or two of the of the release of the Warren Report. Mark Lane and Edward J. Epstein did probably the two most prominent ones. Epstein, a lot of Epstein's work, I think, I'm not sure about this, I think it was printed in the New Yorker, the most respectable of all journalistic. So that would actually be an exception to what I was saying before about mainstream. But the New Yorker has always been kind of, although very prestigious, it's always been kind of in a way out of the mainstream. And certainly, you know, under its editor in the 60s. This is a name I know extremely well. This is another thing that doesn't work as well as it used to, my memory. Oh, you know, the legendary editor of the New Yorker, his son's a very famous actor and playwright.
Let's see, is it William Shawn?
Yeah, William Shawn.
Yeah.
His son is Wallace Shawn.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, of course.
Um,
Who's a big socialist, right? Like,
who is?
Yeah,
Yeah,
these are lefties.
Yeah. And William Shawn was fairly left too. I mean, he decided to turn the New Yorker against the Vietnam War, and at a time when that was not all that a respectable thing to.
I was going to say, didn't Seymour Hersh publish a lot of his stuff in the New Yorker?
Seymour Hersh did, right, yeah, exactly. So yeah. I mean, the Warren Commission report was taken apart pretty early. Mark Lane, in his book Rush to Judgment, he describes the Warren Report as kind of an interesting way to look at it. He said, you know, the Warren Report makes perfect sense, and is, you know, in a sense, perfectly respectable, even as a prosecutor's brief. If your job were to prove that Lee Oswald, you know, acting alone killed Kennedy, this is what you would come up with, and you just ignore everything else, which is the way the legal system works, right? Because the prosecutor doesn't go around gathering evidence for the defense, right? I mean, if he comes across it by accident, he's obliged to turn it over to the defense, although I think they usually don't, but legally they're supposed to. But I mean, you know, that's the logic of the of our legal system, that we have this adversarial system, and the prosecution puts the strongest case on one side and the defense on the other, and then the judge and the jury are the ones who make the final decision. But of course, in this case, there was no defense because there was never a trial. And you know, the assassination of Oswald, you know, is an interesting part of the entire story.
Well, I mean, so much of what you write about is crime fiction and noir and mob movies and detective movies, and it seems like, you know, this JFK movie Oliver Stone made is in part a detective crime story. I mean, to me, it intersects with so many things. I mean, true crime is so popular a genre today, and I feel like when this movie came out, the JFK Oliver Stone in the early '90s, there was already a sort of subgenre of popular literature and fiction that was really obsessed with crime and detective stories and murders and things like that. So it feels like JFK as a movie fits right into an already established genre of detective fiction, or crime fiction. So you mentioned like Oswald being assassinated. Well, that fits into like every mob movie I've ever seen. Is the assassin gets killed, instantly they got to dump that guy because he knows too much. And it seems like, I don't know, can you talk a little bit about that kind of intersection of like fiction and reality? Because it seems like the JFK quote unquote story is one that's so important in one way or the other. And it almost, I don't know, I don't want to say it doesn't matter what's real or what's not, but the form of it all seems important in some way. It's like our national movie is JFK.
And following right from that, Jack Ruby, of course, was a real person. Seems like somebody who could have stepped out of a film noir. I mean,
totally, yeah.
He owned a few nightclubs in Dallas, which featured attractive young women taking their clothes off and dancing and serving drinks and so forth. He was known to be. He had connections with the Chicago Mafia. He was a bag man, apparently, for them. He was also very close to the Dallas Police Department. They frequented his clubs and, were never allowed to pay for their drinks and that sort of thing. He would come by the police headquarters around Christmas, distributing presents and that kind of thing.
Wow.
It's said that when he shot Oswald, and we leave aside for the moment exactly how could somebody so easily get into the Dallas Police Department, at the time that the man accused or about to be accused of killing the president is being transferred from one place to another. But when he shot, when that's just my doorbell, if you can hear that.
Oh, that's all right.
My wife will get it. But by one account, when he shot Oswald, a cop was heard shouting at him, "Jack, you son of a bitch!" I mean, they knew him well.
Right,
so,
right. Wow. It's like one of those characters. I mean, it seems like that's common in the JFK story, is a person who kind of exists in many worlds, right? They have like Garrison is tracking in this film characters like Ruby, who are kind of you find out that they're in the criminal world, but then you also find out that they have military connections, or they were a government agent somewhere, or attached to the police force in some city. I mean, it seems like it all that stuff also fits into that noir world, that kind of feeling that like there is a I don't know, there is a kind of criminality to the operation of everyday life in America that is happening right in front of our eyes. But we don't generally see it. And I don't know. I don't want to be too poetic about it, but it feels like the JFK assassination is in part like a glimpse of that, right? Like a glimpse of like the real operation of how things work. That seems like what's so compelling about Colonel X sitting there telling that story is you're kind of like, this is, I'm finally getting the real stuff, right? I'm finally getting like how it all really works. We suspect there are dark forces that are controlling everything, and maybe because we're right, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, Garrison, who's a very interesting, very interesting figure. Himself. I once went to a book party in New Orleans. It was a biography, a first volume actually of two volumes of biography, a very laudatory biography of Jim Garrison. He was dead for some time at this point, but a number of the people, fictionalized versions of whom you see in the movie, his young, assistant district attorneys, the people who were helping him investigate, they were old. This is 2005, I think it was. Yeah, it was just after Hurricane Katrina. That's the way we remember things in South Louisiana.
I can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the hotels and restaurants were just reopening, including the one where this this party was held. But anyway, they were old men by this time. But when they were young, they had worked with Garrison, and they turned up to this thing. But yeah, I mean Garrison was Garrison did not begin as any body particularly left wing. I mean, he was a liberal by New Orleans standards, and he was a Kennedy liberal. He was an admirer of the president. But what he was, I mean, he was a prosecutor, right? He was the district attorney of New Orleans. New Orleans has always been a great crime-ridden city. It's always been one of the main sites of the Dixie Mafia, so-called. So yeah, I mean that's how Garrison got into investigating the murder of the president. I mean that this was the sort of thing that he dealt with all the time. I mean he knew all these knew of all these various mob types who were important in New Orleans.
That seems like that underworld was right there. Are you from Louisiana originally?
No, not originally. I've lived here since 1984, though. So yeah, okay. I feel pretty much like a native. No, I'm from North Carolina originally. But
okay, whenever I speak to scholars around your age, I'm always wondering sort of what was your attitude about all of this stuff when you were a young person, if you remember heading into college, because I mean some of it becomes, especially it seems like story, that you're interested in fiction and storytelling. How did that connect to what was going on in the world? What were you thinking about the Vietnam War and the counterculture and all that stuff? Because you were in college and as an undergrad in the 70s, right?
Yeah, 69 to 73 was
okay. Yeah, that's right in there.
Those were my undergraduate years, but particularly relevant to what we've been talking about so far. I must be among the last people. It's kind of weird to think that's true, but it must be true. I must be among the last Americans who have clear memories of the assassination. It was. I guess in my lifetime, at least, it was the first and still the most shattering of all those events that you will always remember where you were and what you were doing. When you heard, I was sitting in 7th grade math class, and it was actually a few hours after the president had been pronounced dead in Dallas. But eventually the principal got around. He didn't even make an announcement. He just turned on a radio and played it over the PA system. We kind of gradually, took a few minutes to figure out what had happened. But wow. Yes, that was quite shattering. I mean, assassination was something that you read about in the history books. We all knew that there were 3 American presidents who had been assassinated: Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley. And the notion that it could happen now again, that there would be a 4th. And I mean, the fact that Kennedy was so young and seemed so athletic and vibrant physically, that, I mean, obviously that doesn't make you immune to bullets, but it just made it seem all the more shocking on an emotional level.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, it seems like I mean, it's a story that Oliver Stone would tell too, right? Like, I mean, it's kind of a cliche, but there seems to be, people talk about a loss of innocence. I think they're talking about young people, especially people in that baby boomer generation who were of a certain age. My dad, he's 78 years old. He was born in 44, and he was a little older when the assassination happened, but he still talks about it as a major moment, and one in which the kind of like before and after kind of thing. As time went on and you were college age, where was your head at in the late 60s and early 70s? Because it seems like a really chaotic moment politically and culturally, where you sort of focused on getting going to college and doing the higher education racket, or where were you politically in that time?
The movement against the Vietnam War. I mean, that was my chief political identification. That and the civil rights movement, which were, of course, the two major political movements of the of the 1960s and early 70s. And at the end, you've got the beginnings of the women's movement. Yeah, it was a lively time. And
I guess I'm curious kind of how because we're always talking about academia on this program. Talk to so many people who went and got PhDs, especially in the humanities. And I'm kind of curious, kind of like, how did everything that's going on in the world, Vietnam, civil rights, your sort of concerns about those things, how do they flow into, if at all, do they connect at all to what become your academic concerns, and thinking about science fiction and thinking about crime fiction and thinking about kind of Marxist analysis of texts like that? How are those things connected? In other words, I guess I'm asking, how did you come to study what you study?
Yeah, no, it had a great effect on me personally. I mean, in a sense, it's a hard question to answer. How did this world affect you, because it's the only world I lived in,
right?
So I don't know what it would have been like to have lived in a different world. But as a matter of fact, I can remember relatively early in my career, and by no means all of my work, but in some of my work, thinking that, well, I'm sort of beginning to write the history of my time. I think I first felt that a relatively early essay of mine, which had some success in the world, was about MASH.
Really? That's interesting.
Primarily about the television show, although of course its first iteration was as a novel, and then Robert Altman's film, and which I talk a little bit about those, but it's mainly about by far the most important, influential version, which was the television show. And I mean, that, of course, was, essentially a Vietnam show. I mean, it was, literally about the Korean War, but it was the Korean War as seen by the, people who had experienced the America of the Vietnam generation. Actually, the show itself, in the very last episode, it acknowledges that it's at the very last episode where the war's ending, right? The armistice is being signed, everybody's going home, but there's still work to be done, and it's a scene in the operating room, because there's still people who were wounded before the guns went silent. And the doctors are operating, and the PA system is playing the news, which is mainly about the end of the Korean War. But then they get in President Eisenhower has approved something like aid to the government of Vietnam. It's something like that. I can't remember exactly what it is. And Klinger, the company clerk, the sergeant, he said, Vietnam, where's that? And
Uh,
Colonel Potter said, it's in Southeast Asia. So, I mean, that was kind of, I thought, an interesting,
it's so haunting too. I mean,
yeah, acknowledgement that, that this show that you've been watching for 7 years now, which is ostensibly about the Korean War, it's really about the Vietnam War. And, um,
mm. It seems like, I mean, it seems like that whole era. I mean, I know it's become a sort of standard story in some ways, told by Forrest Gump, Ken Burns. The kind of that era that included the Vietnam War, Watergate, all the assassinations. That it burned out a generation of people who sort of entered into the world with a certain kind of hope and optimism about the future. Do you buy that story? Do you feel that that's kind of a cartoonish story of what American life was like then? I feel like in some ways, and this, maybe I'm guilty of this myself in part because of the sources I look at. But I mean, you think about like Oliver Stone, his life experience is one that is what he goes to Vietnam. He has an extraordinary life in a lot of ways. And at the same time, it's kind of told as a kind of there's a sort of sense that everybody had the similar experience of going to college and being a hippie or going to Vietnam, when it seems like the population in the United States, part of the problem with it was that most young people didn't go to Vietnam. Most young people didn't experience exactly that story, if that makes sense.
yeah, I mean, there are, I'm just sort of thinking of my own
Yeah.
memories of that time. I mean, you can't write history without making generalizations, but the the reality on the ground is always more multifarious. It's always more complicated and diverse than the generalizations. I mean, there were lots of young people in the '60s who didn't care about the Vietnam War, particularly one way or the other, except probably they cared. They might have cared they didn't want to go there.
Right.
But weren't profoundly interested aside from that. There were people who smoked dope and people who didn't. But yeah, I think the kind of generalizations that you were suggesting, I think I think they're about as accurate as generalizations.
Yeah, right. I guess so. I'm thinking about
tend to be.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. You make judgments when you're telling stories of like what you're gonna tell. I mean, the idea of making the film JFK. I mean, they started with like almost a script that was almost 600 pages. The idea of honing that story down to something that could be told in a coherent 3-hour cinematic experience is just filled with making those kinds of judgments, I guess. And I think it's weird because it seems like those critics that hated it, that thought that it had distorted history, were kind of looking for a documentary, and this film isn't a documentary.
Right, yeah. I mean, on all of those essays by political journalists, people who are not film critics, but if they're going to write about a film, you would think they might, remember that film is an art form. It has its various resources and techniques, like editing, for instance. They tended to completely ignore that. As if it were not even so much if it were a documentary, but as if it were a newspaper story.
Or an editorial, right?
Yeah, which of course it isn't. No, I mean the film The film doesn't claim to know who killed President Kennedy. It doesn't
Right.
claim to.
Right.
It strongly suspects that Clay Shaw was involved. Beyond that, no individual is named, but it is quite sure that it was more complicated and more political than what the Warren report had.
Before we go, I have to ask you about mob movies and crime movies, because you've written about those Godfathers, Scorsese's, Goodfellas, Coppola, and
favorites of mine.
Billy Wilder and all that kind of stuff. I love noir and crime fiction and that kind of stuff. I'm thinking about Goodfellas came out around Goodfellas came out around the time that JFK came out, in the early 90s. I think 1990. And I remember that, those films I came alive to movies, I think, through movies like that. But can you talk a little bit about why crime fiction in general captures our attention? Because it's something that looking at your stuff and thinking about talking with you today, I was thinking a lot about how true crime is just an obsession now. Everybody's listening to podcasts, murder, so much kind of interest in that criminal underworld. And for a long time, the mafia was kind of carried that fascination, I feel like, in American cinema. And maybe it's in other places now, and the mafia mob movies still make money. But what is it about crime in America? I know it's a big question, but
one interesting thing about crime fiction is that it has been used to make absolutely diametrically opposed points. And actually, in the tradition of crime fiction, especially, there's a fairly clear national distinction between the British tradition and the American tradition. I mean, the British tradition, which goes back primarily to Sherlock Holmes, and then you've got Dorothy Sayers, Agatha Christie, all of that kind of thing, takes as its foundational assumption that society is basically beneficent. Society is run by people who have our best interests at heart, but unfortunately, there are these individual crimes, generally murders, although they're not always murders in the Sherlock Holmes stories. Later, they tend to be in Agatha Christie, for instance. And so what you need a superlative detective like Sherlock Holmes or Miss Marple or Lord Peter Wimsey, or, there are many others, of course, who can identify the murderer, who's arrested, removed from society, whether by being imprisoned or being executed, and then society is wonderful again.
That's not an American vision. Yeah,
that's not an American. No. The American tradition, to an astonishing degree, it was founded by a single individual, Dashiell Hammett, who actually was a detective. This is no longer quite true, but for a long time he was the only writer of detective fiction who had actually been a detective. He worked for the Pinkertons for a long time with Dashiell Hammett, and then with his most important follower, Raymond Chandler, and then with a whole lot of other stuff. You get an assumption which is the exact opposite of the Sherlockian assumption. It's that society is fundamentally corrupt, and crime is crime narrowly defined is simply one part of the general corruption of society. And there are people whose job it is to arrest criminals, but they never get to take the kind of satisfaction in their work that Peter Wimsey or Sherlock Holmes would take, because they know that the situation, nothing fundamental has changed. I mean, some individuals may be put in jail, but I mean, often. I mean, especially this is true in Hammett. The cops are often there as corrupt. They're all in Red Harvest, which I think is the greatest of all American crime novels. The police force is essentially just another gang, and of course you get a somewhat different but fundamentally allied version of this when you get to the great mob movies that begin with The Godfather in 1972.
It's interesting, that connection between like noir detective movies and kind of like Philip Marlowe world, and then the mob movies, because they're not quite the same in terms but they both are sort of touching on this underworld idea. But it seems like I don't know, there's something fun, so kind of bootstrappy American entrepreneur idea about the mob movies. I think about Scarface, or Godfather, obviously, but even Goodfellas has such a working class sort of attitude about it. It's like, the world's not going to give it to you. You just got to go out there and fucking take it, and that, like, we thought the people who rode the subways every day to their jobs were suckers because they saw, and these guys see through that society's just a big scam. It seems like there is, like, it's almost like the mob characters in these movies. I don't know if you would agree with this, but they sort of accept that the world is corrupt and that you kind of got to make your own way in it.
Oh yeah. And the Godfather, I'm going to say the original one, but I mean really all of them, but especially the first two, which gives you the story of Don Corleone, the character, played first by Marlon Brando and then by Robert De Niro. I mean, it's the American dream. It's the American success story. As we learn, we don't learn it in the first film. In the second film, we learn, this is the guy, he gets to America. It's hard to imagine somebody who's in a worse position than he is. I mean, his entire family has been killed. And he's by himself on a ship to America. He knows no English. He knows nobody in America. And then to top it all off, he what's the disease he has? He's put in quarantine when he first arrives in New York. Is it diphtheria? I think it's something. So it was a disease that was quite common in those days. That part of the film, it's a great shot. It ends with he's sitting in it's essentially a cell, a prison cell, or a quarantine cell, by himself, knowing nobody, sick. Yet he doesn't seem all that distraught. He's singing a rather cheerful little tune to himself, and you look out the window of his cell. What do you see? Statue of Liberty.
Of course, yeah.
It's the American dream, and sure enough, he grows up to be the man who, has all these judges and politicians in his pocket, and lives in this, very luxurious mansion. It's the American dream, but the American dream is a crime boss, a man who is responsible for all manner of murders. The mob movie and film noir are not the same thing, but there is one interesting direct connection. One of my favorite TV of the detective TV shows, always the Rockford Files. I've always been a big James Garner fan ever since I was a little boy and watched Maverick.
Of course.
And it's interesting, because Rockford, he's a noir type detective. He's a detective in the tradition of the Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler detectives. In fact, he played Raymond Chandler's detective Philip Marlowe in at least one film version.
And you could throw the Western in as a genre here as well. That kind of, it's funny to think
of
Garner as that cowboy character. Because I know you've written about John Wayne. It's a whole other thing. But yeah.
But anyway, I get we're running out of time. Just quickly. But what happens in the Rockford Files, in most of the stories, is that the mafia somehow turns out to be involved in the case that Rockford has taken on. One of the very young writers for the Rockford Files was David Chase, who grew up, so to speak, to create The Sopranos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's all of a piece, and I mean, Sopranos. I know you've written about Sopranos too, which is like brings so much of that stuff into the late 20th and early 21st centuries. I mean, people now, young people online, are still talking about Sopranos a lot, in part because it's recognizable to them as a world they grew up in. Yeah, which is funny to me because it's like, it's a mob show, but we all knew that it kind of wasn't at the same time. It was really about America in this particular cultural moment. Yeah, it's funny that world is so recognizable. I mean, that's part of what Chase's brilliance, I guess, is taking a family like that and making it every family. But God, there's such a streak of darkness to all of it. I mean, when you think about crime fiction, American crime fiction, that vision and the fact that sells in America, that people like hearing that everything's corrupt and it's all broken and there's no good guys. I mean, it's pretty bleak. I'm thinking about I mean, you probably know this, but like there's French film critics that identify noir, right? The Nino Frank is a French film critic that writes his piece in I think the mid 50s. It says there are some weird, or maybe late 40s, early. He said these are some weird movies coming out of America right now, and they're crime, but they're like way, way different than most crime movies. They show the world in a very dark place, and I don't know. That's interesting coming out of like the victory of World War II. Is you get just a ton of movies that show American life is just rotted out from the very center.
Yeah, and of course they had a tremendous influence on the great New Wave French directors. I mean, Jean-Luc Godard's first film, Breathless, is very. But here's an interesting. I used to tell my students. Do we have time? Is there?
Yeah, go for it. I love it.
Yeah. One reason that the French critics were able to recognize what was going on in Hollywood cinema in a way that Americans generally hadn't is a very particular reason. You have to remember what watching movies was like in those days, right? No streaming services, no DVDs. Let's say you were interested in Hitchcock. He makes a film, you see it. You have to wait another year or so to watch another Hitchcock film. Outside of maybe New York and Los Angeles, and to largely not even then, it's not easy to see films, right? Mm-hmm. But what happened after World War II as part of the Marshall Plan and general cultural as well as economic American imperialism, dominate Western Europe, was all these films were exported to France. So suddenly, people like the young Jean-Luc Godard and the young Francois Truffaut, they can watch 5 Hitchcock films in a day. Oof. And then 5 more the next day.
A feast.
And so they were actually able to see what was going on in a way that would have been very, very difficult, if not impossible, for most Americans to be able to.
That's interesting. And then so they would be the ones that would be able to identify the pattern more easily.
Exactly.
See it all at once and be like, oh, wow, it's pretty clear to me that Americans have a fucked up attitude towards crime and power and the way the world works. I mean, I'm glad we started with JFK because I feel like JFK then, it picks up into so many of those streams, right? Of like, there are dark corners in American life. And you see a president, and one that I think it's important that you mentioned that the president is this good looking celebrity guy. He gets killed in broad daylight in front of everybody. I mean, obviously the Zapruder film didn't come out for a little while and it wasn't like live TV, but at the same time, it's such an insanely brazen act. It's hard not to just become a paranoid lunatic in thinking about what did this, and what forces did that. And it seems like a whole world of prepackaged fiction, which, I don't know, intersects with reality in that moments. And in those moments, it feels like it could only go that way in terms of thinking about JFK and that murder as something that sort of splits the society open in some way. I don't know.
Imagine what it would have been like with today's technology. There would have been thousands of people with their iPhones doing videos.
I do think about that. I think about if that's the future for us too. Major moments of violence and assassination caught on camera. But still, you see conspiracy theory is stronger now maybe than ever before in American life. I mean, conspiracy theories are sort of forming the backbone of the Republican Party, at least one element of it right now. And that seems like, I don't know, in a weird way, JFK assassination opened up that possibility in a wider way than ever before, which was that a huge portion of the population could just not buy stories that they're being told by mainstream journalists, politicians, etc. It's hard. It feels like that. You talked about the shattering of a consensus. It feels like that part of that is right there in Dallas.
Yeah. And in fairness to those who actually believe the Warren Report, or at least believe the Warren Report is more
sure.
or less,
yeah,
they do have one interesting argument. I mean, not a detailed argument about the actual contents of it, but about the sort of ideological surround of it all. It's true, I suppose, that the Kennedy assassination was such an emotionally shattering thing. Nothing in my lifetime has happened that, with one exception, was even, I think, remotely close. The exception, of course, 9/11.
Sure.
But I don't think that even 9/11, was shattering in quite the way that the Kennedy assassination was. And so, whether or not there really was a conspiracy, there probably would be an emotional tendency to think that there's a conspiracy, simply because, the disconnect between one apparently unimpressive guy and all of this, what it's done to our country. It can't just be that. It must be it must be more than that. I have no doubt that, the fact that large majorities have always shown most Americans to think that there was a conspiracy behind the assassination, does owe a lot to this purely emotional factor. On the other hand, things can be emotionally satisfying and be true nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, there's an emotional truth to things too. I mean, we get into like Tim O'Brien territory in terms of like story truth versus happening truth or something. But I think that's part of what I was getting at with the whole like crime fiction thing, is that these stories partly, for me at least, the way I see it is like noir fiction resonates in American life in part because people do experience the world that way. They experience it as dark corruption. And they understand that noir is actually tapping into something real. And so that's why, to me, when JFK is assassinated, the noir fiction sort of psychological preparation for that is in part sort of giving people, I don't know, noir gives people the critical faculties to see the world as it is. I guess that's one way of looking at it. Is to me, it's like noir fiction is kind of giving people a practice of seeing the world and being kind of skeptical about what people say and what people mean and that sort of thing. I love noir in part because it feels so truthful, which is a weird thing.
I think it is. What were the terms for story truth?
And happening truth. In Tim O'Brien's book, The Things They Carried About the Vietnam War, he talks about that kind of idea.
I'm not familiar with that particular book, but that's an interesting distinction. I would say, they're not the same thing. On the other hand, they can vary only to a limited extent.
There you go. Yeah.
I
Right.
think that's
Yes.
yeah. So
It's not so, they're not so opposed. Yeah. Interesting. Wow. There's a lot to think about there. Carl Freedman, I want to thank you for a really fun conversation. This is a lot to chew on. And I also want to mention Don DeLillo's book. We didn't bring it up, but the Libra about the JFK assassination. That book, it's kind of like the Oliver Stone in the sense of it presents a lot of different strands. But to me, reading the Don DeLillo book was the first time, which is it's a work of fiction. First of all, it's like a novel, but reading that, I was kind of like, this seems plausible to me. This is, there are a lot of moving parts, there are a lot of different plans happening. All of a sudden, JFK is assassinated out of all of these plans sort of coming together in weird ways. It felt, I don't know. It's weird to say that DeLillo's novel has a feeling of authenticity to it. I don't know if that resonates with you.
I think it does. I mean, it's been a long time since I read it, though I wrote briefly about it somewhere or another. If I remember correctly, I mean, it's an interesting premise that three rogue agents of the CIA decided to almost kill Kennedy and to try to pin it on Castro in the hopes that this would, more or less force Kennedy to take a more aggressive attitude towards the Cuban Revolution. But then of those three, that's what two of them really intended to do. But the third one decided, no, we're not going to just almost kill Kennedy. We're going to actually kill Kennedy. I mean, again, who knows?
Right. Of course. I found the idea plausible that there would be multiple plans overlapping, and that some of them are some of them are half plans and some of them are full plans, and then out of that there's also this weird loner, and he's kind of being used by multiple different groups in weird ways, and then some of them hearing that it actually happens and they're like shocked. Oh wow, that actually happened. I didn't think they were actually going to do that. It just, I don't know, there was something about it that felt like these are the layers of, this is how bureaucracy works. These are how things happen in big institutions with multiple moving parts.
Yeah, I think that's a very fine novel.
Well, thank you again. This was really fun. I appreciate it.
Yeah, good talking with you.
Good talking to you. Well, okay, I think that's going to wrap us up for Nostalgia Trap today. I want to thank my guest, Carl Freedman, for a really fun conversation about JFK. We've got another one all about Nixon coming up on the Patreon stream next week, so stay tuned for that. And if you're not subscribed, why aren't you subscribed? Support our show. We appreciate it. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Link is in the episode description. Stay tuned for lots more. Hope you're doing well. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.